Anyhow, pleasure to be here. A little bit of background. I was CEO with Fresenius Medical Care for about 15 years, retired, and ran into this company in Berlin and basically joined it, and I'm CEO of this company. So again, from one German company to another one, but I'll try to show you what I think we can accomplish. Okay, this morning, there we go. Let's see. I'll talk a little bit about the components which we make ourselves. Essentially what they did starting in 1993 at the Charité in Berlin is coated iron oxide particles such that when you inject them into a tumor with a reverse biopsy, they stay in the tumor. And after that, they would basically use the next nanoplan, look at the CT scan, see how many particles are there, what's the concentration, what's the temperature, and then they modified an MRI machine to where the magnetic frequency alternates about 100,000 times a second, and that heats up the particles. So that's pretty much the technology that we're working with. They did about 120 studies on various patients, essentially got a CE mark for the treatment of glioblastoma, which is a very, very aggressive disease, and they were doing a lot of work with prostate cancer, trying to augment brachytherapy. Basically, the market for the brain cancer is about 250,000 cases a year. It's not a large market, but there is a real need for something that is a better treatment than exists today for the treatment of glioblastoma. So we have kept that in Europe, and I'll talk about what we're doing. Now, when I came in 2014, the process was you remove the tumor, which is about 25 cc in size. The surgeon does that. And then he kind of figures out, he or she, where they didn't get all the cancer, because you can't remove it all in surgery. And so they would tell the technologist and serotactic oncologist where to inject the tumors, and where to inject the nanoparticles, and then basically treat with heat afterwards, and it would be the source. That worked pretty well. They still have the record today in terms of longevity after treatment. For 2,300 months. However, that was very cumbersome, so what we ended up doing is essentially placing that into a mesh that the surgeon puts around the outside of the cavity to keep the cavity from filling with blood and causing necrosis. And that works really well, because what happens there is you basically then bring it to about 50 degrees centigrade. You create an immune response in that area, and we've had very good results, as you can see in the next slide. Without that treatment, within 2 or 3 months, you start to see little basically nodules of cancer starting to return. It has a 95% return in terms of reoccurrence in terms of glioblastoma. However, when we treated them with nanotherm, essentially we pretty much wiped out what was left around there. So we think we've got a pretty good process, and we've got patients now that are alive 2 to 3 years later with no symptoms at all. Now, with that, we are in the process of commercialization. Like I said, we have the CE mark, so we're in the process of commercialization. We're targeting 4 countries, and they have about 10,000 glio patients a year in those 4 countries. We need about 250 a year to essentially break even. We'll do about 45 to 50 in 2020, and then ramp up from there. So I think we're well on our way. We need to get reimbursement, but crowdfunding works very well, because there's a lot of charities out there that want to help these patients, and they certainly need help. Okay, this is our sites. We basically put these in a container and set them up at the various hospital sites around Europe. Now, turning to prostate cancer, the second area that they spent a lot of time in Berlin working on prostate cancer, but it was using the heat effect to basically make the brachytherapy, low-dose brachytherapy, more effective. Didn't want to compete with that. There's just too much money being spent on prostate cancer therapy at that point. And so I decided that we would focus on really intermediate risk prostate cancer, which shows up in your active surveillance programs, but those really only exist in the U.S. They're starting to come on in Europe, but they're 10 years behind where they are in the U.S. because the U.S. developed them after they did the PSA testing and overutilized that. But anyhow, they're there. And so right now, there's about 300,000 active surveillance programs, 300 active surveillance programs in the U.S., and a large number of patients being followed. Our target is pretty much the intermediate risk, which means that, okay, you come in and you're followed in active surveillance, and about 1 to 2 years later, maybe even longer, you start to see the PSA rise, you do an MRI, you start to see a cancer develop, the index cancer. Now, we have, whoops, doesn't, okay. Oh, okay, is that better? Ooh, I'm sorry. I don't have to repeat it all, do I? No, okay. We were able to convince the FDA that we're not a drug, we're a device, because it basically stays in the tumor, and so we're in the process of doing our clinical trials. We just finished stage 1, which basically we were looking to 2 things on stage 1. Could we put the particles in as a reverse biopsy and place them into the area that you need to place them to ablate the index tumor? And secondly, what are the side effects? And the FDA is, of course, all of these cancer treatments have numerous side effects in one area or the other. So we finished the first stage, and you could just see on the slide, we developed a process to be able to put the particles where we want them, and of course heat it with the magnetic field and ablate the cancer. Now, what we also found that the side effects really were no different than a biopsy, which we didn't really know from the beginning, because a lot of the work that was done in Europe was done on a whole gland and different techniques. So with this, we're really quite pleased because the side effects were really not significant at all. Typical of a biopsy, the patients would go home in the evening or go out to dinner in the evening. So we're now working with the FDA on the next stage, which I want to streamline because that'll be our commercial process. So we're moving towards the next stage. Now, again, that's the whole presentation. We're listed, Magforce AG is listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, and Magforce USA is a wholly owned subsidiary not wholly owned, 67% owned by Magforce USA, other US investors, and it's doing the work on prostate, and AG is doing the work on glio in Europe. And so I think at this point I finished early. So I think we don't take questions. We're going to take them in the breakout session, right? Well, I'll give 2 minutes to the next guy. Thank you very much, folks.